2. There was another reason which attracted Christian missionaries to the shores of the Mediterranean. The Jews had taken the same road before them, and the Acts of the Apostles informed us that Paul and his fellow missionaries always preached to the Jews first, and only turned in the second resort to the Gentiles. Very likely the Apostle made no formal rule of this kind, but there is every reason to suppose that the book of the Acts correctly states his actual practice. He could not well do otherwise. He argued from the Old Testament, and those who had no acquaintance with it could not possibly understand the reasoning of one who, through the law, had died to the law. Indeed, we may assume without fear of serious error that in apostolic times, even heathen converts had either been formerly Jewish proselytes or had at least some knowledge of the Old Testament in the Greek translation. Thus, the Jews of the dispersion prepared the way for Christianity and helped to determine its geographical course, though they soon became its bitter enemies. 2. The Jews in the dispersion. The Jews had spread from Palestine to Egypt and further Syria, thence to Asia Minor, till they had their settlements in all the lands of the Mediterranean. As early as 140 BC, the Jewish Sibyl boasts that the whole earth and sea were full of Jews. Here, of course, allowance must be made for patriotic exaggeration, but the allusions of classical writers abundantly prove that the Jews formed an important and conspicuous element to the population of the Roman world. 1. The Jews of the early Roman Empire were in one respect quite unlike the Jews of our own day. They had not yet displayed on any large scale their genius for finance. The Jews owed the wealth which they acquired at a later period to the prejudice of Christians. Of those they acquired at a later period to the prejudice of Christians. It was at a much later time than that with which we have to deal that the world, having become Christian, looked on loans at interest as criminal and left open to the Jews a door which the Christians had chosen against themselves. But the day of Jewish riches was still distant. Here and there wealthy Jews were to be found. There were princes like Herod Agrippa, one who was the favourite of Caligula, and afterwards of Claudius, and ladies of rank like Berenice, the Jewish beauty, whom Titus was on the point of marrying. Generally, however, cultivated society only thought of the Jews as of petty and squalid hucksters, who lived in low parts of the town, as of a hateful and contemptible race who obstinately separated themselves from their fellow men and were addicted to a foolish and lazy superstition. Their horror of pork, their Sabbath day, their circumcision, all made them the butt of Roman wit. 2. Nevertheless, the Jewish religion was recognized by law, and the emperors paid it official respect. They did everything to satisfy the Jews, provided that the Jews would show themselves loyal subjects. The Jews were excused from appearing in a court of law on the Sabbath. If corn was distributed as a public dole on that day, the Jews could receive it on another day instead. They were not required to serve as soldiers. More than that, the Jewish community in the heathen town had formal authority to exercise civil jurisdiction over its members, and was even permitted to decide criminal cases and inflict corporal punishment within certain limits. Hadrian, for we need not consider the madness of Caligula, furnishes the only exception to this general toleration. After the Jewish rising of 133, he forbade the Jews to practice circumcision. However, this prohibition was withdrawn by the next emperor, Antonius Pius, so far as it applied to those who were Jews by birth. The law could not always save them from the fury of the people, who were irritated by their strict monotheism. But a Jew who practiced his religion peacefully always had the imperial authorities on his side. Christians sometimes professed the Jewish religion with the express object of securing the protection of the law. 3. Judaism, despite the scoffs of literary men and the hatred of the people, made many converts during the first century and a half after Christ. Probably every Western synagogue had its proselytes, while in great cities, especially in Rome, they were counted by thousands. Josephus Flavius tells us that the general public had long shown great interest in the Jewish religion. There is no town, he adds, among Greeks or barbarians or anywhere else, and no nation to which the observance of the Sabbath after our ways has not penetrated, and in which the kindling of lights and many of our laws on food are not practiced. And that's from Josephus against Appian, 240. This propaganda was due partly to that proselyting spirit which is so severely condemned in the Gospel according to St. Matthew, and at which Horace laughs, but it was also due to the condition of a time in quest of new faiths and rites, and particularly inclined to Eastern religions. Judaism also owed much of its success to intrinsic superiority. It was originally a tribal and afterwards a national religion, and it never ceased to be the religion of a race. It would never had the heart to deliver its message to the world at large. Yet for a time it seemed to be on the point of doing so. The Jews exiled in foreign lands still held to the law. Some parts of the law, however, necessarily fell into disuse. They were far away from the temple and so could not sacrifice. And that was from Josephus against Appian in regards to Josephus 240. Most of them had no farmland and no cattle. They could not therefore keep the law of tithes. Accordingly, they tended more and more to lay stress on monotheism, on the moral parts of the law, on the purity of their family life. They were as yet content to use the Greek version of their scriptures. Even the prayers in the synagogue were said to be said in Greek or Latin. The inscriptions on the tombs in Jewish cemeteries were 4 centuries after Christ, written in Greek or Latin, not as now in Hebrew. They could boast of writers quick to adapt Greek philosophy and literature to the service of Jewish monotheism. In short, Judaism all but promised to do what Christianity did, for example, to supply the desideration of a moral, rational and universal monotheism. But from about the middle of the 2nd century after Christ, the legal and exclusive phase of Judaism obtained complete ascendancy. Far from seeking proselytes, the rabbis declared that a proselyte was not to be trusted till the 25th generation. Day and night, said a great rabbi, are required for meditation on the law. That hour which is neither day or night may be given to the profane writings of the Greeks. In this way, Judaism shrunk into its old limits, and Christianity took up the work which Judaism had been preparing. Christianity took up the work which had dropped from the hands of the Jew. Meanwhile, Judaism had been preparing the way for a daughter better able than she to conquer and to rule. 3. The spread of Christianity during the 1st century. The New Testament, and especially St. Paul's epistles, supply much authentic and tolerably full information on the spread of Christianity in apostolic times. 1. The earliest evidence that we have leads to the belief that the first disciples fled to their native Galilee when the crucifixion of their master plunged them into terror and dismay. It was there apparently that their faith and hope revived. There they were first convinced that Jesus lived, not in the shadowy world of the dead, but in heavenly glory. His spirit, as they thought, had come from heaven and appeared for brief moments to assure them of his victory over death and Hades. It's Hades talking about the grave. Right? Hades is a mythical Greek abode of the dead. Full of this new confidence, they returned to Jerusalem, the holy city. Outwardly they were still Jews, observing the law and worshipping in the temple, but they were bound together and separated from other Jews by their common belief that the risen Jesus was the Messiah, that he had redeemed them by his death, and that he would soon come again in the clouds of heaven to establish the kingdom of God. Even at Jerusalem there was a large admixture of Jews from the other countries of the Roman Empire, and we may well believe that such of them as became Christians promoted a liberal spirit among the disciples at Jerusalem, and had a sense, more or less definite, that the religion of Jesus was meant to be universal. Stephen, one of those Hellenistic or foreign Jews, is represented in the Acts of the Apostles as a champion of this larger and nobler thought, and though the speech attributed to him is evidently the composition of the narrator, it may and probably does represent Stephen's views. Be that as it may, Stephen's death and the persecution of the Christians which followed it certainly promoted the spread of the gospel in a wider area. The new teaching was proclaimed among Samaritans, some of whom received it. It established itself on the coast of Palestine, not only in Joppa, but also in Caesarea, a heathen town which had its circus and theatre, its temple dedicated to the worship of Caesar and Rome, and in which Jews formed but a fraction of the population. The next stages were Phoenicia, Cyprus and Antioch, which last was, after Rome and Alexandria, the most populous and magnificent city in the world. The mission at Antioch was, for more reasons than one, a turning point in the history of the new church. The church at Antioch was not a colony from the mother church at Jerusalem. It was planted by men from Cyprus and Cyrene, on the northeastern coast of Africa, by men whose names have perished, but who must have been Hellenistic Jews. Converts were made at Antioch from the heathen world, and this rather by force of circumstances than in virtue of any concerned plan. The new doctrine may have spread from the suburbs and poorer quarters of Antioch till it reached the centre of the city with its Greek civilization. Thus, Christianity, which had begun at Jerusalem, was born again at Antioch, and for the first time manifested or revealed its independence of the Judaism from which it had sprung. So it was completely independent of Judaism. 2. One consequence of the change was that the outer world now recognized the disciples as a separate sect and gave them a name derived from the official title of the leader whom they followed. It's according to Tacitus. It came from the Greeks. Christus was a loaned word by the Romans, which meant slaves to the Christos or Christus. Just as the followers of Pompey or Herod known as Pompeians were known as Pompeians or Herodians, so the followers of Christ were now called Christians. But really, if you look at the scriptures, it wasn't until Paul went to see either Barnabas or Bartholomew abroad, and he found these people that probably they were converts, non-Jews. So that's when he first termed them Christians. So he may have carried that to there, and then from there they're called Christians in his circle, right? But Romans would have been calling them servants to the Christos way before he went there, probably. During apostolic times, the title was not, so far as we know, used by Christians themselves. They spoke of each other as brethren, believers and the like, while the Jews called them Nazarenes. Like the disciples called themselves Mashiachai. They refused to be called Christian, their pagan name, to start off with. Because they were Galileans, Jews, Galilean fishermen under the Jewish law, under the Pharisees, the Mosaic law, etc. And they were kosher Jews up to a certain point. And they never they thought it was no good to hang out or sit next to non-Jews, non-kosher Jews, Gentiles, etc. They wouldn't even talk to them, apparently. They spoke of each other as brethren, believers and the like, while the Jews called them Nazarenes. But during the 2nd century the title was accepted by those on whom it had been imposed, and has been cherished by them ever since. We may be sure that the name Christian was given by persons who did not understand that Christ was the Greek translation of the Hebrew word Messiah. It means the anointed one. And they took the word Christ for a proper name, and when the disciples of the new faith adopted it, they too so with little thought of their master's claims to be the Jewish Messiah. That point was invested with supreme interest for the first disciples. It held quite a subordinate place in the mind of the later church, recruited as it was from the Greco-Roman world. So it obviously came from the Romans, a Greek loan word, and then Paul maybe heard of it, and he went to visit Bartholomew or Barnabas, and he decided to call these others, these converts, who probably weren't Jews, Christians, and then it caught on, right? Three, a passing notice is all that can be given here to the great apostle who strove to free Christianity from the limits of Judaism and to make it universal. He first attracted attention at Antioch, which was not far distant from his native Tarsus. Antioch was the starting point of his first missionary journey. Thence he sailed to Cyprus, landed in Asia Minor, and visited the cities of its southern coast. Afterwards he travelled further west across Europe and established churches at Philippi, in Thessalonica, and Corinth. At Corinth, where he spent a year and a half, and perhaps at Athens, in Greece. Later, Ephesus was the centre of his work, and he died, as we shall see further on, at Rome. We know very little about the work of the earlier disciples who had lived with Jesus. We have the best possible evidence, that of St. Paul, for St. Peter's appearance at Antioch, and the tradition that he, like St. Paul, died at Rome, is accepted by many competent and independent scholars. The same may be said of another early tradition according to which St. John spent the closing years of his long life at Ephesus. The stories told about the rest of the 12 are in part contradictory and vague and are wholly worthless. 4. What we know of Christianity during the time when the little band of the original disciples was dying out is briefly this. It had its churches in Palestine, but Palestine, a few years after St. Paul's death, lost much of its hold on the Christian imagination. In AD 70, Jerusalem was stormed by Titus, the temple was burnt down, and the city became a heap of ruins. So it continued till in 136 AD, or perhaps somewhat earlier. Hadrian built on its site the new city of Aelia Capitolina, in which Jews were not even permitted to live. Beyond Palestine, Christianity had won firm foothold in Antioch, all along the coast of Asia Minor, and in some of the inland cities in Macedonia and in Greece. It had penetrated further south to Alexandria, where Mark the Evangelist is said to have preached, and further west to Rome, which after the fall of Jerusalem contained more Jews than any other city in the world. Antioch, Alexandria and Rome were then, as they continued to be, long afterwards the chief seats of the young church. No authentic tradition survives to tell us how or by whom the gospel was first brought to the imperial city. It is certain that neither St. Peter or Paul can have founded the church, and we must be content with the conjecture that some Jewish proselyte to Christianity travelled to Rome, persuaded a few of his countrymen to believe in Jesus, and so laid the foundations of a church destined to exercise the most momentous influence on the fortunes of the world. St. Paul intended to visit Spain. That he really did so is scarcely possible, though the belief that he landed there can be traced to the latter part of the 2nd century. It must be remembered also that the list of churches contemporary with the apostles is apt, even when reduced to its real bounds, to convey an exaggerated impression. The churches may have been, and generally were, very small, so long as the presence of Christians did not stir the Jews to righteous acts. It was scarcely felt by the great heathen world. Thinking, for example, of the church at Corinth, apparently all of its members were able to meet in a single house, that of Gaius, Romans 16:23. We have no statistics of the Pauline churches, and there is little advantage in conjecture-based. Example, on the number of persons in the Ephesian church whom St. Paul salutes in the last chapter of the epistles to the Romans. It had been thought that the number of St. Paul's converts in Asia, Macedonia and Greece did not exceed 1,000 in all. nor is there any objection to this conjecture, except that it is mere conjecture. Of these, as St. Paul tells us, not many were wise, not many were noble. Here and there, however, exceptions occurred. At Corinth, St. Paul counted Erastus, the treasurer of the city, among his converts. Before the first century ended, the Christian faith is said to have had adherents even in the imperial family, in the Roman families, etc. The evidence for this assertion does not reach absolute certainty, but it rests on arguments which raise it to a high degree of probability. We know from the historian Suetonius that 2 near relations of the Emperor Domitian were condemned by him. The one of these, Flavius Clemens, was, according to Suetonius, a man of despicable inactivity, and another heathen historian tells us that he was put to death for atheism. That could be in that Roman sense where these people were of a certain religion and they refused to do the bull sacrifices, etc., etc., and they were labelled by certain Romans as atheists. These were Christians, the first atheists. An inclination to Jewish customs. His wife, Domitilla, also a near relation of the emperor, was sent into banishment. So for the accounts corresponded very well with the idea concerning Christians commonly held in the Roman world. A useless life without interest in public affairs, atheism, or refusal to worship the gods of the state. There you go, as we said. These were those who refused to do the bull sacrifices, bow down to the many statues decreed by the Senate through the emperor sitting on the throne. He had to profess that he was a god or divine or descendant of the gods or this sort of stuff. So these people refused to do that, so they were punished accordingly. At first they were like, the emperor said, I just leave them alone, they're not really bothering anyone, but the certain Roman kept pushing it and pushing it and pushing it. Why should they be any different? Why don't they do bull, be part of the pagan practices, the bull sacrifice and all that sort of stuff? So he ended up getting his way. A useless life without interest in public affairs, atheism, or refusal to worship the gods of the state, the Roman state, were just the charges made against them, and to the end of the first century they were constantly confused with Jews or Jewish proselytes. Further, Eusebius, quoting a heathen historian who died about 220, expressly affirms that Domitilla was a Christian. Lastly, in modern times a cemetery has been discovered, clearly intended for a Christian burial. An inscription bears records that it was given by the kindness of Domitilla, niece of the divine Vespasian. It is situated near the cemetery in which the Roman bishops of the 2nd and 3rd centuries were buried. This is from Sueton, Vit Domitian 15. Dio Cassius in the Epitome of Shephilinus 14. Eusebius Ecclesial History